Unfortunately, I'm going to be really quick about this, which saddens me because we should be developing this sort of more through discussion, but I'd forgotten that we hadn't finished this lecture. So for the example of the yeoman and Yankee farmers, the origin of the difference was the geography of where they came from, basically cultural differences that they started with from where they were, from where they came from, which might have been shaped by environmental conditions in like Germany and versus sorry, England and Scotland. Um, but um, but interestingly, both um, the yeoman, the sort of German origin, and Yankee farmers lived in the same environment and foraged in the same way. So I'm going to sort of write these out. Um, um, so environmental variation, maybe in original source countries, but not in Illinois, right? They farm the same land for the same crops using similar technology, right? What's different is whether their willingness to rent out their land or to rent land to farm more versus sticking with what they're able to own. Um, and the motivation to like sell the farms when farming is in some decline rather than passing it on to their children. And that leads also to differences in how they teach children, what kind of schools, church attendance, stuff like that. Genetic variation, I'll just say no. Um, Similarly to, and that's actually very similar to the Newer and the Dinka example. The origin of the difference, well, one tribe probably used to be, um, the Newer were, I think, an offshoot of the Dinka, um, and they lived and grazed in the same environment, and there was no genetic variation between them either. So the phenotypes for the yeoman and Yankee farmers were uh, basically like what I just said in the previous slide. Um, whether they whether they were willing to rent out or sell their own land, whether they rented land to farm, um, the kinds of churches that they attended, and the schools that they sent their kids to, and primary also the cultural values of basically staying on the farm versus seeking out opportunities wherever they might be presented. Um, so the phenotypes are willingness to rent land and sell land versus owning and passing on to children. Values of continuing to farm versus per pursuing, you know, new opportunities. And then there were differences in schooling and church, what churches they went to, and church attendance. So in this case, the question is whether biased transmission which is sort of similarly a little bit more like Dawkins' memes or other modes of transmission are important in this system. And this is a case where with the yeoman and Yankee farmers, it actually, vertical transmission seems more important. However, size of the community is more a function of philopatry versus dispersal. Basically, whether people leave the towns than what we would think of as like, fitness and family size and stuff. Then survival and reproduction. Okay. So this is interesting. Is cultural evolution by natural selection important in this example? How does it work in kind of what I said before? It's not so much like family size or survival to reproduction and stuff, or like avoiding predators, natural selection, but movement seems to be, is really important. Like, to what degree does your do children, you know, decide to settle near where they grew up and remain in those communities. So natural selection is important in this example. It's important to see how, in this case, it's not just survival and reproduction. Okay, so we were talking about the units of cultural selection. According to Dawkins, he's really excited about memes as like an analog or even a homolog to an analog to genes. Although, aside from the fact that it's like a really catchy idea, like we all talk about memes now, even though most of us probably didn't think of Richard Dawkins when we've talked about memes like, songs or TikToks or, phrases that are especially catchy. But, Dawkins coined the term, and he did it because he wanted something that rhymed with gene, right? So it's like a memory gene. And most of the examples of memes, most of what we think of are, these sort of small units. And however, these smaller units can potentially be linked into larger functional units. The thing is that like the the similarity to genes is really only analogous, and it's not a very good analogy. In other words, it's not that memes in Dawkins' idea are going to lead to genetic change, although we're going to see a whole bunch of examples of how culture leads to genetic evolution in humans and animals. And then the other thing that's sort of weird is that the selection, there isn't like natural selection in the idea that like some memes lead to greater reproductive success and that's why they become more common. In Dawkins' view, memes are more like germs. They just travel epidemiologically from person to person. So selection, as much as it happens, is just on the level of memes, right? So different ideas are sort of competing for our attention. And that means that Dawkins is only thinking about or focused on biased transmission. So the idea that ideas can travel from one to another, and much less of any focus on whether different cultural practices lead to differential reproductive success or growth or decline of those communities. So kind of like I said, selection is not dependent on reproductive success or survival, but only on our other people imitating those memes. And that process ends up being somewhat like tautological. That means circular, which is an objection that people have raised about natural selection. although um, the like in natural selection, there's actually a way to think and understand how natural selection works that's not circular. It's just that what is evolving are the traits, and the traits become more common, not because by definition they're becoming more common, but because on average, individuals that have those traits have more offspring, or their offspring survive better, they have more grandchildren. And that's how the traits become more common. In memes, it is actually sort of much more circular. And it actually it makes memes more similar to like parasites rather than genes, right? Um, and any belief, any idea or belief could be called a parasitic meme. And so Dawkins, singles out religious belief as a parasitic, as a parasitic meme, um, probably because he doesn't want to sort of give um, credit for any sort of adaptive functions of religious belief. But there are other evolutionary biologists who are a little bit less antagonistic, and one is David Sloan Wilson, who I'll be assigning a chapter of a little bit later. Sorry, I've got a couple books of his, but I can't reach them right now. Um, he's actually like really interested in the adaptive function of religious beliefs. That's not like a study of the truth value of specific beliefs, but of what are the benefits to individuals and communities, and on what level might selection be operating to have favored belief systems, which is an interesting question. Um, so there are a number of criticisms of the meme concept, mostly that it doesn't really get you that much anywhere in terms of either cultural evolution or natural selection. Um, so it it discounts the fitness, costs, and benefits of different cultural traits. Um, so if the only thing that's important for ideas to spread is their ability to spread, you don't have to break your teeth trying to figure out whether these ideas are functional or adaptive. Um, you just have to figure out what makes ideas catchy. What are we pre-wired to prefer? Um, and then the other thing is that it hasn't led to sort of interesting insights about cultural transmission. In other words, ideas are different than genes. Genes are physical things, little bits of DNA. They get passed on. They don't have to be expressed to be passed on, whereas culture does have to be expressed, um, unless we can preserve it in books, which can kind of save things even when you're not actively doing them. Um, but the mode of transmission is important, and doesn't really get studied, which is kind of why uh, which is kind of why like there isn't really much of a research field in memetics. There was a journal. The journal's closed down. So I'm not totally sure. Okay, let's go. The other So in contrast to memes, genes are really well defined. Like, we understand what they do. They code for proteins. They have a physical structure. They have a beginning and an end. They get passed on whether they're read or not. We understand a lot about how they get passed on, and we're learning much more this decade about how they are read and expressed, which ends up being as important as being passed on. Um, so you don't, but the important thing is that, like, natural selection doesn't require a cultural unit like a meme, right? Beliefs, knowledge, preferences, those can be sort of large overarching ideas or small specific skills. And they don't have to act like genes for them to have fitness consequences for groups or individuals and be favored or not favored and passed on through cultural evolution. Um, so basically, like memetics or memes are an attempt to like create an inheritance unit like a gene when there actually isn't the need for an inheritance unit for cultural beliefs, knowledge, preferences, attitudes to have beneficial or harmful fitness consequences. Um, okay, so I'm just going to leave us at that. um, so if so you don't need memes to have cultural evolution. However, it's still really important to understand how um, cultural knowledge, beliefs, practices are passed on. Is it mostly vertical from parents to offspring, or is it mostly horizontal or biased? And that ends up being important because vertical transmission, if vertical transmission is the only way ideas are being passed on, if we really just learn stuff from our parents, then cultural evolution would act sort of just like genetic evolution, and ideas would spread based on how much they contribute to like reproductive success. Um, if it's just biases, if all transmission is sort of horizontal, um, then what we need to understand are just like what are the genetic predispositions to different beliefs. Um, Richardson, Boyd and Richardson are arguing in their book that vertical transmission is at least somewhat important. And as they're going to make in an argument that you're going to read later on if you haven't read the whole book yet, which most of us haven't, um, there's the way that cultural learning operates. It's also in Henrik. The rules that we've started to talk about, um, prestige bias, uh, imitation, conformity bias, and um, punishment and enforcement of social norms um, will lead to traits being basically homogenized within groups that will then make groups more different from each other and will make group level selection much more important. So that's like one of the main take home messages of the course. You don't have to, it doesn't have to completely make sense now, but in the second half of the course, it had better make sense. We'll be coming back to that idea a lot. Um, okay, so this is kind of like just doing a little bit of a summary, differences between cultural and genetic evolution, that the source of variation in genetic evolution is random. In cultural evolution, um, it's sometimes it's you could think of it as random or luck, and then sometimes due to intelligence and like brilliant insight, or both. That's where like new ideas come from. Um, the selection is in genetic evolution is um, non-intelligent and random. It's just based on differences in reproductive success, the average differences in reproductive success that individuals with or without a trait have. In cultural evolution, that could be important. And like, so you can see that in the Newer and Dinka example, right? Where one, where the way that they defined kinship and inheritance and family size led to incredibly important differences in ability to raise a large army, which then led to, significant consistent differences in, success in battle. But it wasn't an intentional, like people's belief about, uh, who are their family, was not an intentional belief system that was designed in order to win wars. It basically, that was a case of sort of random selection. In this case, the selective force being success in battle. Um, Genetic evolution is, almost entirely vertical. Genes are passed from parents to offspring. Cultural evolution, it's both. Like we learn things from our parents, not what they tell us, but what we see them do. And then in some ages, we try to do the opposite of what our parents do, but some stuff, has been sort of baked into us in frustrating ways. But horizontal transmission is obviously incredibly important, and it's going to vary in different cultures. Some cultures are going to enforce more vertical, and others favor more horizontal or provide the opportunity for more horizontal transmission, which is really interesting. So genetic evolution is basically Darwinian as defined by random variation leading to differences in average reproductive success becoming more common. Cultural evolution is sort of by definition Lamarckian, because cultural learning is an environmental trait. And so the beliefs that you acquire and develop over your lifetime will have a huge influence on what you pass on to both your children and to peers horizontally and non-relatives. Cool. Okay. Um, so that catches us up with just the little sort of introduction to cultural evolution, and now we're going to go back to social learning. And um, so what we just actually might be more useful to look at to go over, return to this slide, which was, in connection to that pigeon experiment. There'll be more pigeon experiments, but we can now see like, different kinds of social learning, some where you're just alerted that there's a resource and you have to work things out for yourself, blind imitation, observational learning, where you learn not just what's a resource, but how to exploit it. Um, and there's a long history of studying social learning. Um, and a lot of social learning doesn't involve teaching, right? Remember, we haven't seen a lot of examples of teaching yet. We've seen the tandem running in ants, but there's a lot of learning that can go on just by being in a social context and having the opportunity to observe the behavior and the reproductive or mating success of other individuals, and there you go. So we're going to go over a bunch of different kinds of examples of learning that's influenced by observation of or interacting with other animals. So one example of imitation of behavior basically is that in when you live in a group, you can see the foraging success of others in the group and you can imitate those choices. We're going to see a bunch of examples, but this is osprey. And what these graphs are showing basically is that if no osprey sometimes nest in sort of gregarious semi-colonies, and if a bird returns with a fish, then everyone in the colony potentially knows that that bird has been successful and is likely to return to the same spot where they had success, and it might be good to follow them and go in the same direction. And so what the figure on the left is showing is that if an osprey returns if no osprey returns with food, then the directions of foraging trips afterwards is random. But if an osprey returns with, in this case, an alewife, that's a kind of fish, then then basically all the other birds leave the colony in the same direction, um, which actually is an especially good strategy for alewives because alewives are um, uh, a gregarious fish, right? Like the joke, why are fish so smart? Because they have schools. Anyway, alewives are uh, you know have large schools that they swim together with. Um, and when they had an opportunity to see a successful forager and go out in the direction where that forager came from, they were more likely, it took them less time to catch a fish, right? So that's what we're seeing here. Informed ospreys took, you know, usually less than 10 minutes to find a fish. Whereas the ones that didn't have an opportunity to see a successful forager, sometimes it took them an hour to find a fish. Cool. Um, so another kind of social learning is public information use, and which is when individuals acquire information about the quality of an environmental resource, like a food patch, breeding habitat, by attending to the relative success of others within the same environment. Um, so this has been studied by a number of behavioral ecologists, Malone and Templeton, also Verdonchen, Lucalan Giraldou, Jenny Templeton is now at Knox. Um, and in contrast to social learning, where you're like observing them doing a behavior and then imitating that behavior, or observing them feeding in a certain spot and feeding in that spot, um, public information use, you get a general idea about good and bad habitat by observing the success and behavior of others. So we're going to see this in a couple contexts. So one thing that's interesting is what this example is going to show is that you can learn from failure of others as well as from success. So starlings often are found in flocks and groups. Starlings foraging in groups can learn about patch quality from observing the success and failure of others. So in these trials, they'll set up arenas with seed hidden in sand. So the birds can't actually see the seeds, but they can see other birds looking, pecking, searching through the sand, and they can see how often they're finding food. So they can get a measure of patch quality from the foraging success of others. And so this is, in this case, that's what this trial was showing. Um, in this case, N stands for negative, or like no reward. P stands for positive, that they're seeing the birds succeed in getting a seed. And interestingly, um, they um, they have the highest foraging success. In other words, it takes the fewest number of trials for them to, collect a given number of seeds when they observed the failures of other starlings. So they learned like which cups to avoid. If every time they saw a starling, um, you know, investigate a cup, it got a seed, they didn't learn that much about what were the better and worse patches to forage in. Interestingly, control and a mix of rewarding and non-rewarding outcomes for what they were observing were sort of intermediate. So in this case, they were really learning what patches to avoid by observing lots of failure, which was kind of interesting. Um, Another kind of public information use is called inadvertent social information. So in this case, this is when birds observe the breeding success of either birds in their own species or even another species and can use that breeding success um, to guide their own habitat choice. So this is a really cool, I mean, one thing that you'll learn is we know a lot about birds that breed in nest boxes, right? So that's why we know so much about gray tits and blue tits, and kestrels, European kestrels, because they nest in boxes, and pied flycatchers. We know a ton about pied flycatchers because you can put out 1,000 nest boxes in a large area and then easily survey them and manipulate them. So this is a wonderful experiment where I think it's Blandine Doliguez um, manipulated the brood sizes of pied flycatchers so that the parents were rearing large broods, broods that were controlled by having the chicks switched around or not switched around, but no change in the number, or um, reducing the number of nestlings per box so that when young of the year would be investigating. That's what the really clever thing was, that once they banded the birds in the area, a number of researchers observed that, like, hey, a lot of young birds are just sticking their heads in other birds' nest boxes. They're not like predating, they're not eating them, they're just sticking their heads in. And they're like, maybe they're trying to see like if, you know, this is a place where successful broods are being reared. So they did this experiment. And interestingly, like when you manipulate the size of the broods, you make the parents work, and that can be kind of crappy for them, right? So in this figure, you see that if you increase, I is for increase, right? Increase the two different controls, and then D is for decrease um, the number of chicks in the nest. When you increase the number of chicks, sure, you increase the number of chicks that are fledged. If you decrease, if you take a few chicks out, then fewer chicks fledge. But here's the interesting thing. If you increase the number of chicks, they end up all being lighter. If you decrease, they end up being heavier. If you mess with them by doing reciprocal switches, that disturbs them. They get a little lighter. If you don't change the number and you don't mess with them, the chicks are a little heavier. So this body condition um, at of the chicks is like a really interesting measure of like what the manipulation is doing. But that was not the main point of the experiment. The main point of the experiment is, how does manipulating the average size of broods in a patch affect the settling behavior of young birds who are sticking their heads in all these nest boxes? This is the cool thing. Plots with increased broods had more immigrants, right? And plots with reduced broods had fewer young birds settling in those plots the next year. So this is really cool, exciting effect. It means that the young birds are making assessments, learning about patch quality, and that's affecting their settling decisions the next year. Um, and plots with both reduced and enlarged broods have more emigrants. So this is interesting too, because the reduced broods, the chicks are in very good condition, but a lot of them leave. And the enlarged broods, you know, both the parents and the chicks are probably in crappy condition, and a lot of them leave. This one's a little bit harder to interpret, but it's also kind of interesting. This experiment is even more mind-blowing because it's looking at two different species, and what the researchers did was they set up nest boxes in pairs, and because these birds are fairly territorial, they would settle. You know, when one nest box was settled, the other one would be empty. And what the researchers did is they'd switch it up between years, but in one year they would put one symbol, like triangles, on the occupied nest boxes, and circles on the unoccupied nest boxes. And then they put out a ton of empty nest boxes with triangles or circles on them the next year. And so they manipulated the symbols on gray tits and blue tits. And then they tested the settling behavior of pied flycatchers the next year. And what they found is the pied flycatchers would nest in whatever symbol had been associated with occupied nests in the other species the previous year. So they're training them not just like to settle in a given patch, but to settle in nest boxes marked with a completely arbitrary symbol, triangle or circle, the next year. That's what this figure is showing. It's like the number of offspring in the tutor nest. The more offspring in the tutor nest, the more likely that the pied flycatchers in the other species would settle in a nest with the same shape on the on the entrance hole. Totally cool. Okay. Um, Social eavesdropping is a little bit different than public information use. This is when you're extracting information from the signaling informations between conspecifics. So this is individuals are going to make choices depending on the interactions that they observe among others. So this might be you see a contest over a territory and you avoid picking a fight with the winner of that interaction. You're more likely to pick a fight with the loser of that interaction. Or you observe mate choices of others and you copy those um, mate choices. And that's what we're about to look at. Okay. So there's been a lot of work on mate choice copying. And this is so um, we know that females often have preferences and males often have preferences in, the traits of individuals that they're going to be more likely to mate with. And the like usually unstated assumption is that female or male preferences are under tight genetic control. However, there's a lot of experimental evidence now that mate choice can be influenced by seeing the the preferences of others. And so we're going to talk mostly about guppies. It's been the main research project of Lee Dugatkin, but there have been a number of other fish and bird examples that have been studied in some depth. So guppies, the females are big, they're selected for high fecundity, the males are colorful, and a lot of these choices, color, tail size, are traits that have been shown to be preferred by most females. So females preferred males with more orange color. Um, and so you compare male A and male B. However, if an observer or a learner in this figure, female D, sees a less colorful male that is preferred by another female, she's much more likely to mate with that male, which was not observed being chosen as a mate. Right? So this figure kind of describes the next few slides, but now we'll like put a little data on that. And it's a great system for studying because fish tanks, you can kind of control them. You can have in most all of these trials the female's in the center, and she'll be presented with a choice of different males. And there's tremendous variety in coloration in guppies, natural variation, and because selective breeding, people have been breeding funny looking fish for hundreds of years. So the basic experiment is that you present two males to a female, and you then let the female choose, and she chooses by swimming closer to one or the other. And so now you let the female say what her naive, in this case, preference is, untrained preference, and then You take them out, and the next day or an hour later, you put the female in the center, but this time you have a second female in the same tank as the less preferred male. And the question is now, does that focal female's preference shift? So before she liked the green male, but now she's seeing the multicolored male with a second female. And is she going to then imitate the mate choice or the implied mate choice of the female? In fact, this female was given no choice. She was just in that same tank as the male. And in fact, she does. So this figure, at least for me, you need to kind of work through in um, the solid bars are expected preferences, and the open bar is the actual preference of the female. And so what'll also make this maybe make more sense is this is in the um, initial trial, and then this is in the after the training trial. Right? So initially, you put a female in the middle of the tank, in the central tank, and there's one male on either side. There's no expected preference. That's why the expected preference is that is 50-50. But females do in fact have a preference, and you pick the one that that if you present the female with the same choice of males twice, they're much more likely to they're basically they're going to have a preference. So their preference is not 50-50. It's, in this case, it's like 85-15. And so if you take the male that initially is less preferred, but you stick a second female next to that less preferred male, the expectation is, if females have only a genetic predisposition to prefer one male or another, that there should be no change in preference. So null expectation is no change in preference. But actually, 80% of the time, females switch their preference. And this is a nice, repeatable result. It's been replicated a zillion times. Um, there's a lot more questions about this kind of mate choice copying, although it does suggest that, if you want to be more attractive to members of the same or opposite sex, that you recruit friends to join you in social situations to make you appear more desirable, and you know inspire mate choice copying decisions in others. So there's a real question about whether how long lasting is this effect. So these trials usually are done sort of with like a half an hour or an hour in between. Um, but there have been other versions where the time interval is lengthened. So you do the same, you know, two treatments, establish a preference, have a female next to the less preferred, see if there's a switch, and then 24 hours later, you present two similar males to the female, similar to the first trial, not similar to each other. And then you ask, is the, does she revert back to her initial preferred type, or to the learned, the one that the model female was kept with, and in fact the learned preference appears durable, so it doesn't revert back to 50-50 or to 15%. They usually, the next day, they still prefer the male that they've seen a model female with. Cool. Um, so what are the differences between um, public information use, social learning, um, and uh, mate choice, mate choice copying? Um, I've lost the I've lost the power of speech, sadly. Um, um, Sorry, inadvertent social information. That was the third. So social learning, public information use, and inadvertent um, social information. Um, so in the first case, there might be intentional communication, right? There might even be recruitment of foragers, or there might potentially be teaching. In public information use and inadvertent, there's obviously no intentional communication, and there's usually no communication at all. So that's one difference, whether the source of information is like actual intentional teaching or at least direct communication. If there's overheard communication, or if there's no communication, you're just observing the success of others or failure of others and using that to learn. What's similar is that you need you need other individuals, um, and then the capabilities of the learner are going to be a little bit different. So in inadvertent social information, and even social learning imitation, um, you all you have to do is imitate the choices of others. Um, in inadvertent in public information use, there's got to be some counting or quantifying. You have to be able to measure the success of others, which is a little bit different, quantitative assessment. um, and then one other thing to keep in mind is that like honesty or reliability of the signal might be higher in overheard or inadvertent social information or eavesdropping than in direct communication, because the interests of the teacher or model and the learner have to be aligned for direct interactions to lead to useful information. But if they don't know that you're watching them, then they're not going to be lying. Okay. um, so this leads to sort of fitness costs and benefits of learning. Why is it good to imitate the choices of others? And so we're going to look at a bunch of experiments to try to address that. One is, it might be costly to learn, like the time that it takes, um, the danger it might take to investigate and sample new habitats might expose you to predators. So learning might be costly. Um, and as an alternative, and both of these can be operating, learning might just be hard, right? It might be hard to count things. It might be hard to assess habitat quality, but it might be easy to imitate. Um, so there's been a lot of modeling to try to figure out, predict when learning from others versus learning for yourself is going to be beneficial. And it, the evolutionary ESS side of this is not as important. The important part of this framework is just that your expected um, fitness is going to be the average fitness without any learning on your own, plus the gain from learning from learning on your own minus the cost of choosing and sampling. And so basically, the choice that Pruitt-Jones and then many others were looking at was when should individuals sample habitat themselves to learn about its quality versus copying the foraging decisions of others and avoiding any of the time and costs of sampling. Although what's important is like the quality of information um, declines the more everyone is just copying each other versus learning what's actually out there for themselves, right? So that's the ESS part of whether it's beneficial to like try to learn for yourself the quality of a habitat versus scrounging, what we're going to call scrounging, which is imitating um, the choices of others. So if everyone is imitating everyone else, then there's no good information to be found, and you're going to gain a lot from um, investigating different patches and habitats yourself. If everyone is trying hard to search for themselves information, the behavior of others now becomes a good predictor of whether a patch is good or bad, and you avoid all the costs of sampling by imitating, right? So that's why there's going to be a ratio of producers and scroungers, and if everyone's searching for themselves, learning, then it's great to be a scrounger, a copier. But if everyone's copying, then the information's terrible, and you do much better trying to learn for yourself whether a patch is good. So this has been studied a lot with um, with uh, patch choice in especially pigeons and other birds. Um, and the other variable that affects, the costs and benefits of learning has to do with like how on what time scale does your environment change. In other words, if the environment doesn't change, it's great to just copy what everyone else is doing. Um, and there's going to be sort of an intermediate. If the best choice never changes, then you can copy others, but you also like you don't even have to learn. You can have just a fixed preference. If the environment changes super rapidly all the time, you don't learn much from others. Okay. I thought I think what we're going to do now. So we're going to look at a couple experiments. Um, a lot of these questions have been studied with birds, and pigeons are nice because they're sort of easy to study in captivity or semi-captivity. And what I want to do is show a couple videos um, of what this behavior looks like. So I've already introduced the terms. Scroungers copy the behavior of others. Producers um, are those that are actually sampling habitat and learning for themselves whether it's a rewarding habitat. And the choice of whether to be a producer or a scrounger, um, varies with both how consistent the habitat is and especially with what are the behaviors of others. Okay, so um, wanna let's go stop sharing a file, and instead let's share a window, and we're going to take a look at um, some producers and scroungers here. So these are pigeons, and whoops, that's the wrong one. These are pigeons. And you can see there are some birds that are foraging and investigating cups, and then there are other birds that just go over to where the other birds are foraging and investigating cups. Although there's one where it looks like there might have also been like a little mating display going on rather than foraging. But you can really see some birds are like going to different cups and sampling, and others are foraging. And then there's that male and female in the lower left-hand corner who's just following um, the female and is not thinking about food at all. Whoops. Okay. So, so um, the frequency of copying should be greater in species or habitats where the costs of learning um, and investigating for yourself are greater. And so this has not been tested enough. So I'm going to talk about like a failed experiment, but it shouldn't be the end of the story. So this was again with guppies, who are usually great for looking at like copying versus sampling, and basically they were the mate choice trial was done except with or without a big fish in a nearby tank, a predator that couldn't actually eat the focal fish, but would have an effect on the perceived danger. And the idea was in a more dangerous habitat, you don't have the time to closely investigate every potential male, in this case, every mate. And so you should use copying more in a more dangerous environment. Um, and so here we have a predator in the tank, and we have a male with or without a model female. Um, so it's very similar, except with the addition of a predator. And um, the, you know, the experiment one, there is no model female, there's a less preferred male. They don't reverse their choices that often. Experiment two, there's a model female. Now they've usually reversed their choices. Um, However, in experiment three, the expectation was that where there's a predator, they should copy more. They should rely less on sampling. And actually, it doesn't really. There wasn't an effect of a predator in this situation. Um, and hunger had the opposite effect as predicted. So they also did this trial with or without predators, and they also did um, hungry versus well-fed females. The idea is that a hungry female doesn't have as much time to spend staring at all the males and should be using copying and imitation more. Um, but in fact, the hungry females didn't change their preference when exposed to the model, but well-fed females did change their preference. So maybe the females were so hungry they couldn't even look at what the models were doing. Um, it's it's still an interesting question, and actually, I haven't done a new literature search on this in a few years, so it'd be totally worth looking at danger and costs of sampling as a as a paper topic. Um, because these are all very sort of artificial trials. Predator in a tank might be a threat, but it might not be because it's in another tank. And it's not clear that like looking at a male or looking at a female is a particularly expensive activity that's a trade-off for feeding for these fish. However, there's really good evidence, even in artificial situations, that um, uh, copying is a strategy that fish are using when the choice actually happens to be hard, right? So the harder it gets to tell the difference between two males, the more likely you are to copy a mate choice decision. And this has been shown a whole bunch of times. And this is, I'm going to do a guppy experiment, but it's been seen in other contexts as well. So we already said females prefer more orange males. And so what the experimenters can do is vary how big the difference in orangeness is. Are they really close to each other in shade, or are they really contrasty and super different? And so in this experiment, um, the treatment one, experiment one, they're very close to each other in coloration. 2 through 4 is, different percent difference in the size of that orange patch, but the males themselves were the same size. So as much as possible, they're the same, except for the orange, and that orange difference is either really subtle or really clear. So what they found was that in was that the females did the most copying when the differences were small. So that's treatment one. In treatment one, the female, so in all of these trials, sorry, the model was always presented next to the less orange male. So interestingly, so the diamonds are control. So it's a hard choice to make, right? So what does this being close to 50-50 mean? It means that without a model, it's hard for female to choose, right? The preference is close to 50-50. But with a model, there's a big shift. However, um, when there's a huge difference between, um, in group 4, when there's a huge difference between the two males, the females prefer the more orange male and don't shift with a model. Right? So that's what this little arrow is. There's only a little change in choice. And then in these intermediate trials, the females can totally recognize the difference in treatment, so they mostly prefer the more orange male in the controls. Um, and then, but if there's a model, they have a big shift, right? So this is really, really kind of cool. If the difference is clear enough, females don't bother copying. If the difference is less great, they copy. Okay, so some take homes are that we think of the alternatives to choice copying as like a rigid genetically defined rule, but oftentimes it's not. The best, most important take home of this producer scrounger stuff is that the alternative to copying is learning on your own, which could be hard. Um, and so um, the relationship between choice copying, which is a sort of short time within generation process, and cultural evolution, which might be like the preferences that we're trained to have, isn't the same for animals and humans. In other words, we do a lot of like cultural training of preferences, beliefs, ideas, and as you can see, like mate choice preferences that are very different from the sort of choice copying, the short-term influences that we see in these animal experiments. Um, and then the other sort of take home is that teaching is much less. It's not verbal. It's often not associated with language, and it's just much less prevalent and intentional in animals than in humans. and we'll see a lot more about that in subsequent lectures. Okay, um, it is 9:13. I'm not sure I can do a great job of zipping through human evolution, although this is pretty short. I'm just going to tell you some of the take homes and um, strongly encourage you to read chapter 15. And I will go over these slides after the exam next week. Um, but some of the interesting things about our being human are one that we are bipedal. We walk on our legs, on two legs, um, and compared to other primates, we have much smaller canines versus other primates, large molars. Although even compared to um, like gorillas that are plant eaters, they still have large canines, which they use as much for display and fighting. Um, we have large brains. We have slow development. It takes us a long time to grow up, a long juvenile period that is needed to grow and mature those large brains. Um, and we also have long post-breeding survival or menopause, which suggests that grandmothering is really important, perhaps more important in humans than other animals. Um, and interestingly, we have slow development, but we have a short interbirth interval that might be on the next slide, which means that to combine long development time and short time between having babies compared to other primates, that means we have a lot of cooperative intergenerational child rearing, at least in our recent evolutionary past. And that's probably connected to long post-breeding survival. We have much more developed cumulative cultural evolution, and that's what the early chapters in the Henrik book are great at explaining, like all the embedded knowledge that's needed for different cultures to survive in different environments get seen when we have like European explorers that are well funded and smart and then die when they're in the wrong habitat, and they'll, their settlements some often fail unless they learn, valuable local survival tools, social tools, plant breeding, plant processing, detoxifying tools from the people who have evolved culturally in an area and learned culturally over a long time the skills necessary to survive, right? Um, and then, I think we'll talk about human evolution a little bit more, but the take home of human evolution is the sequence is really interesting. That we were bipedal before we had large brains, and we had large brains for a long time before we had rapid cultural evolution. Um, and the other interesting patterns are that our toolkits used to change on the time scale of hundreds of thousands of years and sometimes millions of years. And now our tools change on a scale of decades, right? So cultural evolution, we what it if you want to like summarize human evolution, it's that there was lengthy, slow genetic evolution to reach a state where cultural evolution, um, you know, dragged us very rapid through many periods of rapid change, and actually cultural evolution led to um, genetic changes as well. So we'll be talking about that a bunch. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'll stick around to answer questions. And next week, we have an exciting midterm and an exciting finishing this lecture and starting